General Jordan Wicks, a respected war hero, never expected that the most dangerous battle he'd face wouldn't be on foreign soil, but on a quiet street in his own country when a routine drive turned into a confrontation with a hostile cop. It was a bright sunny afternoon. General Jordan Wicks, a tall, black man, was driving down the main road. In his shiny black SUV, he was dressed in his full military uniform, a sign of his service and dedication to his country. His chest bore medals of honor from years of serving in the U.S. Army. Today, he was on his way to visit his mother, who lived in the next town over. As Jordan drove, he felt a sense of pride. He had worked hard all his life to reach where he was, a general in the U.S. Army, position of great respect and responsibility. His mind wandered to his family, thinking of the surprise visit to his mom and the joy he would feel seeing her smile when he arrived. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by the flashing of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. Startled, Jordan glanced back and saw a police car following him closely. The siren wailed as the car's lights flashed, signaling for him to pull over. Confused, Jordan slowly guided his SUV to the side of the road, wondering why he had been stopped. He hadn't been speeding, and everything with his vehicle was in order. As he parked and rolled down his window, Jordan took a deep breath. His heart began to beat a little faster, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He knew the drill. Hands on the wheel, polite and cooperative, he had always believed in following the law and doing the right thing. Officer Clay, a white police officer, stepped out of his patrol car and approached Jordan's vehicle. The officer was tall and broad, his face set in a hard, unreadable expression. At first, Jordan thought this might just be a routine check, but as soon as Clay glanced inside and saw Jordan's face, his attitude shifted. Jordan could feel it immediately. The officer's posture stiffened, his jaw clenched, and a frown appeared. Without greeting or explanation, Clay barked, "Step out of the vehicle now." His voice was sharp and filled with unnecessary aggression. Jordan blinked, taken aback. "Officer, may I ask what the problem is?" he asked, his voice calm and respectful. Hoping to de-escalate whatever this was, "I said step out of the car," Clay repeated, this time louder, his hand hovering near his holster as if he was ready to draw his gun at any moment. There was a tension in the air that Jordan could feel deep in his bones. Jordan stayed calm, though his heart was now pounding. He had faced danger on the battlefield, but this was different. This was his own country, his own people. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. As he stepped out of the car, he stood tall, his uniform gleaming under the afternoon sun. He made no sudden movements, wanting to keep the situation as peaceful as possible. Officer Clay's eyes narrowed as he looked Jordan up and down, his gaze lingering on Jordan's uniform. There was a moment of pause, as if Clay recognized the military attire, but instead of respecting it, his face twisted into a sneer. "What are you doing driving around here?" Clay demanded, his tone filled with suspicion. He hadn't even asked for Jordan's license or registration, standard procedure. Instead, he seemed focused on one thing: Jordan's skin color. "I'm on my way to visit my mother," Jordan replied, his voice steady, though inside he could feel the anger beginning to rise. Why was he being treated this way? He had done nothing wrong. He was a general in the U.S. Army. For goodness sake, shouldn't that command some respect? But Clay wasn't listening. He stepped closer, his face inches from Jordan's. "You're lying," Clay hissed. "You're not from around here, are you?" Jordan clenched his jaw, but didn't respond. He knew better than to engage with someone so full of hostility. Instead, he glanced around, noticing a few cars slowing down as they passed by, their drivers staring curiously at the scene. Some people even stopped on the sidewalk, watching the interaction with growing concern. "What do you have in the car?" Clay asked suddenly, his voice dripping with accusation. "Drugs, weapons." "Step back," he ordered, reaching for his gun. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. Was this really happening? He had fought for his country, risked his life in battle, only to be treated like a criminal in his own hometown. His thoughts raced to his family. What would they think if something went wrong? What would happen to his career? He raised his hand slightly to show he wasn't a threat. His mind racing. Officer, I'm not armed. I'm not a criminal. I'm a general in the U.S. Army. But Clay wasn't listening. His hand gripped his gun tightly, his eyes locked onto Jordan as if he were an enemy, not a fellow citizen. The tension was thick, the suspense unbearable. Jordan felt trapped, unsure of what would happen next. His mind flashed through the worst possibilities, and fear crept into his chest. Would Clay pull the trigger? Would this be the end of his life? His story in a situation he had never imagined could happen. As Clay's hand inched toward his holster, the moments seemed to stretch forever. Jordan's breath caught in his throat. What would the officer do next? As Jordan stood outside his car, hands raised slightly in the air, he tried once again to explain himself. Officer, I am General Jordan Wicks. I serve in the U.S. Army, he said firmly but politely. His words were calm, though the knot of anxiety in his chest grew tighter with each passing second. He had been trained to handle high-press situations, but nothing in his military career had prepared him for this. Officer Clay, however, wasn't listening. His face was red with anger, and his eyes were cold and accusing. You expect me to believe that? Clay spat. A general, you're lying. Get down on the ground now. Jordan's stomach dropped. How had this escalated so quickly? He could feel the eyes of people around him, drivers passing by, pedestrians slowing down, some even stopping to watch. A few people had pulled out their phones, recording the scene. The murmur from the crowd grew louder as more onlookers gathered. Some seemed concerned while others stood frozen, unsure of how to help. Jordan took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. Officer, please, if you'll just let me show you my identification, we can clear this up. But before he could finish, Clay shoved him hard on the ground. Now, Clay shouted, his voice booming across the street. With no choice, Jordan lowered himself to his knees, feeling the heat of the asphalt through his uniform pants. His heart pounded in his chest as Clay grabbed his arm roughly and pushed him flat onto the ground. Jordan felt the sharp pain of the rough pavement beneath him as Clay placed his knee firmly on Jordan's back, pressing down hard. Jordan winced but tried to remain calm, keeping his face pressed against the hot ground. The weight of Clay's, and he made it difficult to breathe. Every breath felt like a struggle, his chest burning with the effort. The crowd began to stir more visibly now, several voices rising from the onlookers. Some pleaded with the officer, hey man, stop, he didn't do anything wrong. Someone shouted, let him up. Another voice called out. Others stood in shocked silence, afraid to intervene, but clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. Phones were held high, capturing every second. Jordan could hear the clicks and beeps of cameras and recorders all around him. He was no longer just a man on his way to visit his mother. He was now the center of a public spectacle. Despite everything, he forced himself to remain still, his mind racing. His military training had taught him how to keep his composure under extreme pressure, but this was unlike anything he had faced before. Clay, however, seemed unaffected by the crowd or the cameras. He leaned down closer to Jordan's ear. I know your type, he hissed. You think you're above the law, but not today. Jordan's mind swirled with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and fear. This was wrong, all of it. He had served his country with honor, putting his life on the line for the very freedoms that this officer was supposed to protect, and yet here he was face down on the pavement, being treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin. Tears threatened to well up in Jordan's eyes, but he fought them back. He couldn't let Clay see him break. He thought about the battles he had fought overseas, the men and women he had led, and the sacrifices he had made. He had never imagined that this would be one of the hardest battles of his life right here, on a peaceful afternoon in his own country. The crowd continued to grow, their voices becoming louder. This isn't right, a woman cried out, her voice trembling. Somebody stop him. Jordan closed his eyes for a moment, willing himself to stay calm. What would his family think if they saw this? His mother, waiting for him at home, had always been so proud of him. And now, would she see this on the news? Would this be the image that people remembered of General Jordan Wicks, a man who had dedicated his life to service? The pressure on his back increased as Clay shifted his weight, and for a brief moment Jordan wondered if this was it, if he would become another name in the long list of victims of injustice. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, but still he held on, praying that someone would step in before things got worse. But what could he do? He had no weapon, no way to defend himself. Even his uniform, the one that should have symbolized honor and bravery, seemed powerless in this moment. His mind raced with strategies, ways to de-escalate, ways to talk the officer down. But Clay seemed beyond reason, consumed by his own anger and prejudice. As Jordan lay there, his mind raced. Would anyone step in to help? Could he trust the people around him to stand up for what was right? Or would they continue to watch in silence? The uncertainty noted him as every second stretched painfully on, with the weight of Clay's knee pressing down on his back. Jordan fought to stay calm, but the fear, the helplessness, was unlike anything he had ever felt before. And as the crowd's voices grew louder, the suspense hung in the air, thick and heavy, leaving everyone wondering what would happen next. Just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, the blaring sound of another police siren echoed through the street. A second patrol car pulled up quickly to the scene. The crowd, still growing and buzzing with whispers, turned to see what would happen next. Out stepped a higher-ranking officer, Lieutenant Daniels, his uniform crisp and his expression stern as he marched toward the chaotic scene unfolding before him. The moment Daniels stepped out of his car, his eyes locked onto the sight of Officer Clay's knee pressed into Jordan's back, with a crowd watching in shock. Daniels' face tightened as he recognized Jordan immediately, despite the uniform now dusty from being shoved to the ground. Memories flashed through Daniel's mind. They had served together overseas during a high-risk rescue mission. Clay, what on earth are you doing? Lieutenant Daniel shouted, his voice booming with authority as he strode toward them. The crowd hushed, tension thick in the air. Clay, taken aback by the sudden presence of his superior, hesitated, his face pale. He quickly stood up, stepping back from Jordan, who lay still on the ground, bruised but holding on to his dignity. Daniels looked down at Jordan, his face a mix of shock and fury. General Wicks, he asked, his voice softer now, filled with disbelief. He quickly helped Jordan to his feet. Are you okay, sir? Jordan, dusting himself off, nodded but didn't speak right away. His body ached from the rough treatment, but more than that, a deep sadness weighed on him. His heart was heavy with the realization that his uniform, his rank, none of it had mattered. In that moment he had still been seen as just another suspect because of the color of his skin. Lieutenant Daniels turned back to Clay, his face flushed with anger. Do you have any idea who this man is? He demanded, his voice rising. This is General Jordan Wicks, a decorated officer of the United States Army. He's a hero. What were you thinking? Clay, now visibly shaken, tried to defend himself. His hands trembled as he stammered. He looked suspicious. I thought suspicious. Daniels cut him off, his eyes blazing with disbelief. You pulled him over for no reason, treated him like a criminal, and pinned him to the ground. For what? Because of how he looked. The crowd listened in silence, the weight of the situation sinking in. Many had been recording the incident on their phones, but now the shock of what they were witnessing had silenced them. All eyes were on Clay, who was now fumbling for words. Clay's face drained of color as he realized the enormity of his mistake. His gaze flickered nervously between Daniels, the crowd, and Jordan. His voice cracked as he tried to explain. I didn't know. I didn't realize. He didn't realize. Daniels interrupted, his voice full of disgust. You didn't take the time to ask. You didn't take the time to listen. Instead, you assumed the worst. The tension in the air was thick, the crowd hanging on every word. Clay's breath came In shallow panicked gasps as he stood, there frozen Jordan now standing tall. Despite the pain looked at Clay, his eyes filled with a mix of disappointment and sadness. For a moment everything felt quiet, the world slowing down as Jordan processed the weight of the moment. Would this have happened if he weren't a general? Would Clay have treated him the same if he wasn't in uniform, if his medals hadn't been shining on his chest? The unfairness of it all gnawed at him, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Lieutenant Daniels turned to Jordan, his expression softening. "General, I am so sorry for this," he said, his voice filled with regret. "This should never have happened. Not to you, not to anyone." The crowd, still holding their breath, seemed to shift. Some people murmured softly to each other. Others simply stared at the scene, trying to absorb the gravity of what they had witnessed. The tension, once filled with fear and anger, had now morphed into something else: shame and disbelief. Jordan, though bruised and exhausted, remained silent for a moment. He had been through so much in his life, faced unimaginable challenges on the battlefield, but this senseless act of racism in his own country had left him feeling wounded in a way he couldn't describe. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but full of meaning. "Lieutenant, thank you. But this isn't just about me, it's about what's wrong here. This could have been anyone." His words hung in the air, heavy with the truth. Clay, now fully realizing the gravity of his actions, stared at the ground, his hands trembling. His mistake, the prejudice that had clouded his judgment, was now painfully clear. The crowd remained still, waiting to see what would happen next. Daniels placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder, as if trying to convey a silent apology for what had happened. The air around them felt charged, but the worst had passed. However, the emotional scars left behind would not be so easily erased. Jordan stood tall, but inside a storm of emotion swirled. Would Clay truly learn from this? Would anything change, or would history repeat itself over and over again, just in different faces in different towns? Lieutenant Daniel stood firm, his face a mix of fury and determination. "Officer Clay, you owe General Wicks an apology," he said, his voice cold and firm. The crowd had grown silent, watching the scene intently, waiting for Clay to act. Clay, visibly shaken, nodded, but hesitated. His hands trembled, and beads of sweat gathered on his forehead. "I'm sorry," Clay mumbled, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes focused on the ground. He couldn't bring himself to look Jordan in the eyes. "That's not good enough." Daniel S. snapped. "Speak up, Clay. Everyone needs to hear you." Clay swallowed hard, lifting his head slightly. His voice was louder this time, but still shaky. "I'm sorry, General Wicks. I made a mistake." The crowd, once full of fear and anger, watched in stunned silence. Some of the onlookers began whispering to each other,